Her name appeared in those records an extraordinary number of times, more than 150,000 entries. Not a few mentions, not occasional references, but a presence repeated over and over again. And yet, despite that, she has never been charged. She has never stood in a courtroom, never answered under oath for what those documents seem to outline. For nearly 2 decades, she was deeply involved in the operation, coordinating, organizing, keeping everything in motion. That was the issue Congressman Dan Goldman chose to confront. Not quietly, not off record, but in a public hearing, with cameras rolling and a former Attorney General sitting just feet away. He leaned toward the microphone and addressed Pam Bondi directly. "Attorney General," he began, his tone controlled and deliberate, "I want to focus on an individual whose name appears in these files more than almost anyone else. Someone closely connected to Jeffrey Epstein. Someone who handled his travel, managed his schedule, coordinated communications, and ensured everything ran smoothly for nearly 20 years. And still, no charges, no indictment, barely any questioning." He paused, letting the silence settle. Why, he asked, did Leslie Graff never become a public focus the way others did? On the surface, she seemed unremarkable, easy to overlook. But that, Goldman suggested, is exactly what makes her role so concerning. Because behind that ordinary image was someone operating at the very center of Epstein's world. She arranged flights. She scheduled meetings. She maintained a calendar that investigators would later view as a detailed record of ongoing misconduct. She wasn't just present, she was essential. And Goldman's question was direct. Can someone spend 20 years organizing an operation like that and genuinely claim they didn't understand what was happening? According to victims who spoke with federal investigators, her name came up repeatedly. Not as a bystander, but as the person coordinating access, arranging logistics, making things happen consistently over time. FBI interview summaries mentioned her multiple times across separate accounts. Still, no charges followed. Goldman pressed further. "Attorney General, this individual received a federal subpoena in 2019. She was part of the process, and then prosecutors chose not to move forward. I need to understand why." Bondi responded carefully, pointing to standard procedures and reviews by career officials. But Goldman interrupted, sharpening his focus. "I'm not asking about general process. I'm asking about this person. Her name appears over 150,000 times. Victims identified her. The FBI documented her involvement. And we are told she was simply cooperative, not involved?" He let the moment linger. "Can you honestly say that someone at the center of this for 20 years, handling travel, schedules, communication, saw nothing concerning? Knew nothing that raised questions?" The document suggests something more. Investigators described her as someone who turned plans into action. Financial records connected to her appeared in the files, some indicating transactions that raised further questions. One example stood out, an email from 2014. Epstein contacted a young woman in Europe, suggesting she travel to New York under the pretense of opportunity. The arrangements were handled through Graff's office. And according to the records, this wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a pattern. Repeated interactions, consistently organized, forming a system that functioned with precision. Goldman clarified his position. "I am not making an accusation. I am questioning whether this role was investigated thoroughly enough." Bondi maintained that the investigation was comprehensive. Goldman challenged that, because individuals connected to the financial side of the operation struggled to even have their statements recorded. If that was the case, what does it say about how deeply other roles were examined? There was no clear answer. Maxwell is in prison, but she was not the only person involved. Goldman's concern was simple. Why does accountability appear limited to one individual? Others connected to the operation, including those handling finances and logistics, faced no charges. Graff, despite her documented involvement, also walked free. Victims described reaching out to her directly, relying on her to gain access. She controlled entry points, and people in that position usually understand the system they are maintaining. Goldman's final questions turned more pointed. You led the Department of Justice. These documents were under federal control during your tenure. How closely did you personally review this case? Did you examine the evidence tied to this individual? Bondi hesitated before answering that she relied on career professionals. Goldman acknowledged the response, but his concern remained. Systems are designed to function consistently, but they can also create distance between evidence and consequences. When someone so central, so frequently identified, is subpoenaed and then faces no charges, it raises difficult questions. There is a clear difference between witnessing wrongdoing and participating in it. But Goldman's argument wasn't about certainty, it was about whether the investigation matched the seriousness of the evidence.
Her name appears thousands of times. The role is clear. The outcome feels incomplete. So the question extends beyond that hearing. How does someone so deeply involved for so long never face trial? Was justice fully applied or unevenly enforced? And beyond that lies a larger issue. This situation reflects a pattern seen in other cases, where proximity to power seems to complicate accountability. The closer someone is to the center of an operation, the harder it becomes to define their responsibility. Goldman didn't need to make that claim directly. The implication was already there. Because once you accept that someone could spend decades organizing an operation like this without consequence, it forces a bigger question. How are decisions about accountability actually made? Who is investigated thoroughly and who is not? At that point, the focus shifts. It's no longer just about one individual. It becomes about trust in the system itself. Because trust depends on consistency, on the expectation that similar roles are treated with similar scrutiny. When that expectation isn't met, even slightly, doubt begins to grow. And that doubt doesn't disappear easily. It stays, shaped by unanswered questions and unresolved details. So the issue remains open, not just about what happened, but about how decisions were made and whether they reflect the full weight of the evidence. Because in the end, the most important question is not just about one person. It is whether the process itself deserves confidence. And right now, that question still does not have a clear answer.